Welcome to Season 5 of the Precision Medicine Podcast, sponsored by Trapello. This is the podcast where experts come to discuss the problems oncologists, reference labs, and payers face as precision medicine grows and consider solutions for advancing the quality of patient-centered cancer care. Be sure to subscribe at precisionmedicinepodcast.com to get the latest episodes delivered straight to your inbox. Welcome back to the Precision Medicine Podcast. I'm Karan Cushman, your host and producer, and today we're taking a look at how public policy is playing a role in a critical area of precision medicine here in the U.S. Specifically, the American Cancer Society Cancer Action Network is leading the effort to fill a gap that can exist between a patient diagnosed with cancer and the precise treatment that could save their life. The gap is biomarker testing. I've asked two experts to join me today who are helping champion the ACS CAN effort to pass legislation that expands insurance coverage of comprehensive biomarker testing across the 50 U.S. states. Hilary Gee Goeckner is the Director of State and Local Campaigns for the ACS CAN, and Kristine Ashcraft is a two-time guest of the Precision Medicine Podcast. She's founder and president of YouScript. She's a veteran in the pharmacogenomic space and a member of the ACS CAN PGX task force. Ladies, welcome to the Precision Medicine Podcast.
Thanks so much, Karan.
Thank you so much.
So the million-dollar question we're here to answer today is how can we ensure that more cancer patients receive the appropriate biomarker testing when and where they need it so that their doctors have the precise tools they need to guide the right treatment? Let's dive in by helping listeners first understand the different types of biomarker testing out there. Hilary, would you mind kicking us off by defining what we mean by, say, genetic testing or germline testing versus biomarker testing?
Sure. So there are lots of different types of testing, and there's lots of different words used for similar and related things here. Generally, when we talk about genetic testing, we're thinking about inherited genes and how that impacts someone's risk for developing certain cancers or for passing on risk for certain cancers. So generally we think about that as, informing screening frequency and types, and sometimes genetic counseling for individuals considering parenthood. But when we talk about biomarker testing, we're looking more in someone who has already developed a disease or condition like cancer and using information from their own cells. Sometimes that's tissue from a tumor. Sometimes that's blood. There are lots of other pathways to biomarker testing that are being researched now to understand their individual disease and how their body will react to different treatments. So some of these are germline mutations that are inherited from mom and dad, but others are acquired through your lifetime. So somatic mutations and understanding someone's prognosis going forward for their particular cancer, and if there are particular treatments available already that will be more effective or less effective for their individual disease, and understanding if they'll have a different reaction to different drugs, maybe need a different dose or something like that.
Perfect. So, Kristine, take us into pharmacogenomic testing. That was a nice segue there, and how that plays into testing and treatment decisions. And obviously, we're talking about cancer mostly, but feel free to expand into just, general areas of biomarker testing as we talk about comorbidities and such.
Right. Certainly. So if you have a patient and biomarker testing, for example, is used to determine what therapy their cancer is most likely to respond to get it to go into remission. The other portion of that is other medications you need to take as supportive care or even in cancer treatment itself. So pharmacogenetics looks at genetic variability in drug response to a lot of medications that are commonly used in cancer care and across disease states. Pain management, GI management, so for controlling nausea, for example, as well as mental health medications, cardiovascular medications, all of the medications people had to take before they had cancer diagnosis. And then there are specific cancer medications that also have implications. For example, 5-FU or capecitabine are very commonly given, especially in colorectal cancer treatment. And if you have certain pharmacogenetic variations, and this is not done in advance, about 7% of the population is unintentionally given about twice the dose because of the way that they process medications differently. So if we have that information in advance, we can make modifications to either the drug selection or the dosing to optimize response across all sorts of different disease states.
Great. So let's just talk about what are some of the benefits of the different types of biomarker testing. So maybe starting from that prognostic or predictive viewpoint, Hilary, I know you touched on it a little bit, but get into that familial area a little bit more.
Yeah, so biomarker testing can help match patients with the right treatment and avoid treatments that will be ineffective or unnecessary for them. So if they have a less aggressive disease, they might not need some of the treatments that someone with a different prognosis might choose to pursue. And this allows patients the health benefits of getting on the right treatment at the right time. So often patients are living longer and may have fewer side effects with targeted treatments than with traditional non-targeted treatments. And that often comes with cost savings or cost avoidance by avoiding some of the trial and error and some of the complications with treatments. And this is also really important for helping match patients with clinical trials. Increasingly, clinical trials are looking at enrolling patients based on their biomarkers and not necessarily the body part where the cancer was found.
Kristine?
Yeah. And in terms of the benefits of pharmacogenetics, I actually co-authored a number of studies years ago that validated that utilizing pharmacogenetic testing comprehensively, so doing a panel of PGX tests at one time that helped determine response to drugs across a whole laundry list of disease states, leads to reductions in emergency room visits, hospitalizations, healthcare costs. A recent study came out of Europe. This was a very large, almost 8,000 patient study, I believe, across several countries in Europe. And they did this pharmacogenetic panel testing in all sorts of different areas, including cancer treatment, but also mental health, pharmacies, primary care. And what they found in just 12 weeks, there was a 30% reduction in clinically significant adverse drug reactions.
Wow.
And in the cancer arm, interestingly, they didn't count it as clinically significant unless it was stage 4 or stage 5. Stage 4 is very severe, hospitalization, harm. Stage 5 is death. So we're talking about a significant impact both on our ability to improve clinical outcomes, but also the associated financial outcomes. 2016, the last time we measured it in the US, we spent $528 billion on non-optimized medications. Imagine reducing that by 30%.
Well, yes. And I'm sitting over here still wondering what the 30% might rise to if they had included stage 2 and 3 in the study, right? Now that we've got a good understanding for biomarker testing and its benefits, let's shift back over to the gap in patient care that I introduced in the beginning. So, Hilary, what are some of the reasons why patients who are candidates may not be receiving the opportunity for biomarker testing?
Sure. So, just to start, in biomarker testing, we see a lot of the same disparities that we see across cancer care and really across the whole healthcare system. So, patients who have lower income, are not white, live in rural areas, are receiving treatment at non-academic medical centers insured by Medicaid, lower socioeconomic status are all less likely to benefit from guideline-indicated biomarker testing. And so as treatments become more precise and more effective, we can actually see survival rates and health outcomes for cancer. The disparities in those outcomes could increase as a result of these more targeted treatments if we're not taking action to make sure that there is more equitable access to this technology. And there are challenges across the system that contribute to these disparities in access and outcomes. Patient understanding of biomarker testing is very mixed, but someone going through a cancer diagnosis or treatment for another serious illness has a lot going on. And we can't really expect patient awareness to solve these really dramatic disparities. Physicians have differing levels of understanding and comfort with the clinical practice guidelines and biomarker testing. They're changing frequently, and I'd venture a guess that they might have even less comfort with guidelines for pharmacogenomic testing specifically. Different hospitals and clinics have different practices and policies for how this testing is ordered or who gets what testing, and have different levels of resources. So when you look at like academic medical centers, often the oncology providers are really specialized into a particular cancer type or even more specialized than that. And also, the cancer center may have more resources to ensure patient testing is available, even when they run into barriers with things like insurance or cost.
Sure. And so cost, Kristine, let's touch on that just a little bit from your perspective in the different coverage policies that come into play here and the dynamics there.
Yeah, there have been a lot of publications on implementation barriers for genomics in general, including pharmacogenomics, and lack of reimbursement is often cited, or lack of insurance coverage, in addition to clinicians' knowledge needing to be improved, being able to engage patients, and prioritizing EHR integration to make it easier for providers to know when testing is indicated and how to incorporate that into the patient's care more easily. But on the reimbursement side, we looked at pharmacogenetic policies, for example. And there are kind of two guidelines bodies that people lean on in pharmacogenomics. CPIC, the Clinical Pharmacogenetics Implementation Consortium, is the guidelines body. They provide evidence-based guidelines on, if you have this testing done, here is how you change the drug or dose based on the science to optimize, safety and efficacy. And then the FDA, of course, has guidance in labels. So there was an assessment done across all of these different payers looking at when they would cover things. And a lot of times they only covered drug gene pairs, and those drug gene pairs didn't really have any rhyme or reason on when they agreed with CPIC or the FDA. There was less of them that covered panels. And that's very concerning because most labs are running panels, right?
Right.
And if you only cover this single gene, the poor lab is running a panel that can help impact response across all of these different medications a patient will have, not just at the time of testing, but on an ongoing basis the rest of their life. And thankfully, Medicare issued LCDs in 2020 that took a look at this and said, hey, we'll cover the panel. And if only one gene is indicated and you're doing the panel anyway, we'll let you report on it, as long as it aligns with the CPIC or ARB guidance. Unfortunately, until this biomarker legislation effort, a lot of the commercial and Medicaid plans didn't align with that. And that's really what we need to see to remove one of the major barriers to optimizing medications and reducing patient harm.
Well, thanks, Kristine, for walking us through those scenarios and sharing some of the history for how we got here. Let's get right into the legislation and the alignment and coverage there that you just spoke about that's needed. Take us through the standard legislation as written, if you can, what it's intending to cover and not cover, and how that might vary by state across the U.S.
Yeah. The biomarker legislation was written to cover evidence-based testing. This is not asking to cover screening, but it needs to be something that is in a clinical practice guideline, like NCCN, has FDA approval or indications, or has a coverage determination, as with pharmacogenomics, as I described. And this really helps move. Some of these policies have references when you look at them, at least for pharmacogenomics, that the last reference is like 2014. Like you clearly haven't been tracking more recent updates. So I can't speak to gold standard in other areas, but really the gold standard for policies in pharmacogenomics is aligning with those guidelines. If CPIC and the FDA say you should do this, or in the case of cancer, NCCN or ASCO, you really should be covering this if it's indicated by these professional guideline organizations. And Hilary, I'm sure you can probably expand on that as the expert.
Yeah, so we see really significant gaps between what is standard of care, best practice from the guidelines, and what insurers are actually covering. So looking at NCCN guidelines for biomarker testing in advanced breast, lung, prostate, and melanoma cancers, while the overwhelming majority of policies analyzed in a recent peer-reviewed study reference NCCN guidelines and say NCCN guidelines are something we consider, 71% of people covered by those plans, this is looking at the largest plan in every state, I believe, 71% were covered by a plan that was more restrictive than the NCCN guidelines. And that's looking just at those 4 fairly common cancers with a lot of targeted treatments available, where there is ample evidence to justify the use of biomarker testing. And the plans just aren't following the guidelines, even though they reference them and say we consult them. So that's why ACS CAN worked with a diverse range of partners across patient groups and provider groups to develop some legislative language that could be used in the states to align insurance coverage policies with the latest evidence. And to Kristine's point, the science is evolving, and we don't want this to be set in time. We don't want coverage as of 2024, but as the science evolves, we want to make sure patients are able to benefit. So the legislation and now the law in 20 different states references these outside sources of evidence like FDA approved and cleared tests, labeled indications on FDA approved drugs and precautions, CMS coverage determinations, clinical practice guidelines like NCCN and CPIC, so that those coverage policies can keep up with the science and patients can actually benefit from the latest breakthroughs.
The Precision Medicine Podcast will return right after this. With the explosion of new data and biomarkers in cancer today, how can healthcare professionals keep pace to know which genes will best inform treatment decisions? Trapelo knows. Trapelo is the first single technology platform used by oncologists, labs, and payers to resolve the complexities of precision medicine in real time. Trapelo knows which patients to test and when. It knows which tests are most appropriate, which labs are preferred, and which treatments are most likely to be reimbursed. Visit trapelohealth.com to learn how you can give cancer patients the most appropriate, evidence-based treatment options when time matters most. So where are we across the U.S.? You mentioned 20 states have passed. I know we're at different levels of approval. Can you describe for us where we are in general across some of the states and what maybe some of the hiccups are in getting this passed more quickly?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of interest and enthusiasm in the states from lawmakers of all political leanings. So 20 states have now enacted something like this legislation. And this is requiring coverage of biomarker testing for diagnosis, treatment, appropriate management, and ongoing monitoring of a disease or condition. So it is disease agnostic. This isn't cancer specific, as Kristine has covered. There's so many applications of pharmacogenomic testing across disease states, but also for other types of biomarker testing. There are applications in other areas as well, and lots of research happening. And this legislation typically addresses both state-regulated private insurance plans, so that's individual marketplace plans, small group insurance, some private plans, does not include large employer-sponsored plans because those are not subject to any state insurance laws. It also includes Medicaid. So the majority of those states have passed this type of legislation for both public and private plans in their state that are subject to state laws. A few have done this a little more piecemeal, where the law currently covers either Medicaid or private plans, and we're continuing to work to finish the job in those states and cover the other piece of the market as well.
Great. So why do you think that this has been a state-by-state approach versus looking at it more holistically from a national level? What are some of the complexities and limitations that come into play there?
There is so much policy making, particularly, on insurance and healthcare access issues that happens on the state level. There is a lot of interest and a lot of opportunity for impact. Also, there's not a lot of big policies moving in through Congress right now, and things can happen in the states pretty quickly. So we've been working on this for 2.5, 3 years now at the legislative level, and we've already seen wins in 20 states. And something like this could take a very long time, but also to do at the federal level. But also, this is a way to show the need for action and to build momentum so that there might be a better opportunity in the future when there is an opening for something at a more national level. But there's just a huge opportunity to make an impact now in the states. And insurers, Medicaid programs will start to see the benefits and the impact of this type of coverage policy. And we can see insurers who aren't necessarily covered by this law may choose to adjust their coverage policies to be more consistent with this type of coverage because they see the benefits.
I think it was great too. NCOIL actually endorsed this as model state legislation. And my understanding is that typically when NCOIL endorses something, it rolls across the entire country within a few years. So that was a great endorsement of just how needed and helpful this legislation will be for patients. I say the other thing, I've been working a lot on the federal level on the Right Drug Dose Now Act. It was originally introduced by Swalwell and Emmer, and then Swalwell and Crenshaw reintroduced the Right Drug Dose Now Act of 2024. And at the federal level, there are things you can do to address education. So that would mandate healthcare provider education about pharmacogenomics and the impact that pharmacogenomics can have on reducing adverse drug events. Would look at updates to the FDA adverse event reporting system, as well as a national action plan to reduce adverse drug events, which are the fourth leading cause of death. But that's very education, federal agency focused versus these things that do happen tend to happen more on a state level. Although, Blue Cross is all over the place. It's Blue Cross Blue Shield of Alabama, Blue Cross Blue Shield of Florida. So it really, I think, makes sense to do this at the state level.
Well, Kristine, I was going to ask you about that. I'm glad you brought it up. So the Right Drug Dose Act, where does it stand in implementing that and pushing that out from an educational perspective?
I would encourage everyone to go to fourthcause.org/RightAct to learn more about it if they're interested. But it's sitting in committee right now to just ask for comments on Cures 2.0 reintroduction, and PMC and others recommended actually rolling the Right Drug Dose Now Act of 2024 into that larger Cures 2.0 legislation. It has some other things in it that I think will really help, specifically in pharmacogenomics, like Medicare payment for pharmacogenetic consultations to pharmacists and genetic counselors. As you likely know, unfortunately, Medicare does not acknowledge them as healthcare providers, even though they have far more education than many acknowledged healthcare providers that get paid. So there were a number of things, and then also extending telehealth, which, to Hilary's point earlier, one of the barriers we run into is people in rural and underserved areas, right? Expanding access through telehealth will really help as well.
Wonderful. Thanks, Kristine. I love hearing about our friends over at the Precision Medicine Coalition in there. So, Hilary, I want to be sure that we give some airtime to the tremendous resources that are online and available to listeners here. So we know the American Cancer Society's website alone at cancer.org is already a tremendous resource for patients, of course. And then today we're talking about the American Cancer Society's Cancer Action Network arm, ACS CAN, which is the advocacy group that works on policy issues. You have your own website at fightcancer.org, and there is a whole host of information on biomarker testing access, including a number of patient testimonial videos, which are super informative. So can you tell us what listeners can find there online?
Absolutely. So there's lots of great information on ACS CAN's website, fightcancer.org. There's a drop-down menu to select your state and find out what's happening in your state and get connected with our staff and volunteer leadership. You can also go to fightcancer.org/biomarkers to learn more specifically about biomarker testing. We've got lots of resources available and kind of what's happening in the states. We've got a map there that we update regularly to show the progress on the legislation we've been discussing here. And we just have lots of opportunities for volunteers to get involved in local, state, and federal policy campaigns. So would love to hear from folks and get connected. And we also have lots of really powerful patient stories and videos that you mentioned. Those are going to be on the biomarker testing landing page. That's fightcancer.org/biomarkers. with over 30 patient videos linked there.
Awesome. What can folks expect in their state? Depending on where their state is in this process, what is a typical timeline from once this is first considered to once the legislation is passed? What does that look like on average?
Sure. So it varies a lot state to state. State legislatures can be very, very different. So some states will have legislation introduced and pass it a few months later and signed into law. And then there will be an effective date in the legislation that is typically at least the following calendar year. So law passes, and then there's a little bit of time for everyone to prepare. And then the law takes effect often in January of the next year or even 1 year out. But also, this can be a challenging issue to work on at the state level. And many campaigns like this take multiple years. State legislatures are typically, though not universally, part-time. So bulk will meet for a few months in the early part of the year. January to April, May is pretty typical. And then lawmakers go and have a different job the rest of the year, though it varies a lot state to state. So we are working year-round to keep this issue front and center, as well as other cancer prevention and access to care issues that we're working on. There's things happening throughout the year to educate lawmakers, get more volunteers involved, highlight patient stories, and build out robust coalitions to help make this issue top of mind and front and center when lawmakers come to their state capital to do their work for the year.
What would you both say that at a basic level, what can citizens in their states do to support the initiative there at home?
So I will say people sharing their individual stories is really important and really powerful for all of the issues that we work on, whether you are a provider, someone who's working with patients every day, a cancer patient, a caregiver to a spouse or relative with cancer, or just someone who has been touched by cancer, as we all have. You have a powerful story to share with lawmakers, and your lawmakers represent you and want to hear from you. ACS CAN makes it really easy for volunteers to get involved in state and federal policy, get connected with your lawmakers, and elevate your story, because policymakers need to understand who their decisions represent, or who their decisions impact, and hear from the people they represent about issues like this.
Right. And I definitely want to reiterate the patient stories being so vital. I talked about 5FU and capecitabine at the beginning of the call. There's an entire patient organization dedicated to making this testing standard of care. It's already been standard of care in Europe since 2020. And this is an instance in which if a patient is given a standard dose and they have a variation, they are 25.6 times more likely to experience treatment-related death. But I can throw statistics around all day long. What is really impactful is when you hear from the daughter, the widow, or the person that thankfully had the testing and something was avoided because the right thing was done from the start.
Yeah, Hilary, is there one or two standout patient stories that you could share with listeners?
So we have a lot of really powerful stories from across the country of patients who were able to get on the right treatment or avoid certain treatments because of biomarker testing that helped match them with the right therapy. So a lot of these are very hopeful. One that really sticks with me was this amazing volunteer in California named Pete, and he was able to enroll in a clinical trial for esophageal cancer because of biomarker testing, and he was a retired med school professor, so he knew all of the questions, most educated patient you could ask for. And it still took a while to get biomarker testing, and then was able to get into a trial that was really miraculous at eliminating his stage 4 esophageal cancer. When he was doing so well, unfortunately, he developed leukemia and died from that. And his family feels very strongly that leukemia was caused by his initial non-targeted cancer treatments. And they feel like if he had gotten that treatment earlier and been able to get the biomarker testing and the clinical trial access earlier, that he might still be here today. But we also have more hopeful stories that sometimes also make me cry, but volunteers who, especially several pediatric stories of kids who are able to get in clinical trials or get on the right treatment and are doing really, really well after having really devastating diagnoses and poor outlook, are doing better years later. One great volunteer from the New York area actually had an internship with the American Cancer Society this past summer, and she was, I think, just finishing up college and is doing really well after just a really hard time in her earlier years.
Well, thank you, Hilary, for those patient stories. They certainly give more meaning to our conversation today. And so just as a reminder, for those of you who are looking to understand the role of biomarker testing a little bit more deeply in individual cancers or patient scenarios, just go online to ACS CAN and you'll find a number, maybe 20 or more patient video shorts there. So just to draft off of that for just a moment, I want to highlight a few precision medicine podcast episodes that cover a few of the key cancer types that we've been talking about, especially those in early onset. Episode 60, which is a recent episode with my friend Trevor Maxwell, who is a stage 4 colorectal cancer survivor. Trevor talks about how he considers himself biologically lucky after discovering that he's MSI high and has a Lynch syndrome gene, which enabled his care team to really hone in on the exact treatment along the way. Of course, he's been going through this for a while, but he is obviously a candidate for the importance of biomarker testing. So encourage you to listen to that episode. Episode 53 is with our friends at the Longevity Organization, who are working very diligently to bring biomarker testing to the forefront in the care and treatment process for lung cancer patients. And then finally, one other that kind of hits on the other end of the spectrum is episode 51 with Allie Rogan, who is a breast cancer previvor. And what we mean by that, Allie learned early in her 20s, perhaps 30s, that she carried a genetic disposition for breast cancer. And luckily, her parents shared that with her when she was in her early 20s, late teens. And she sat on it for a little while and then finally decided to pursue learning more and eventually more of her care journey there. So I encourage all of you to listen to those episodes for some really deep dives on the importance of biomarker testing in precision medicine. Well, Kristine, I wanted to give you a minute to just talk a little bit about decision support, because we both really know and work every day in that space. And it's so important to help providers, from general providers to oncologists, have the tools that they need at their disposal in the workflow to make some of these decisions. So could you talk a little bit about what you're doing at YouScript and specifically in the pharmacogenomic space and the progress that you've seen there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been in pharmacogenomics since 2000 and working on some iteration of YouScript probably since 2004.
But this is a clinical decision support tool that can integrate directly into Epic or Cerner or other EHRs, or can be used in a web-based format. But it tells providers when pharmacogenetic testing could be useful in determining a more precise drug or dose selection for the patient. So we can flag based on the medication regimen, hey, Karen, based on your medications, testing is recommended for these medications that have PGX implications. And we also have a patented PIP, a pharmacogenetic interaction probability score. Big word, but it essentially means this is a probability we will recommend a drug or dose change based on genetic test results for these medications at this point in time. So 85% probability or 30% probability. If I can put that in front of a healthcare provider, they can then determine if that's going to be helpful in optimizing that patient's treatment. And then on the other end, once the results are in there, the same way we flag for drug-drug interactions or drug allergy, we've had the technology to flag for pharmacogenetic interactions for a very long time. You know, we've been integrating with Epic since 2015. This isn't new, but part of the Right Drug Dose Now Act calls for upgrades to EHRs to flag for appropriate pharmacogenetic testing and provide information on how to optimize drug or dose selection based on those results. And really, it's about hitting the easy button. You know, as Hilary said earlier, this evidence is changing all of the time. We have so many publications compared to what we had, you know, when medicine was first becoming adopted in the United States even. There's more coming out even in pharmacogenetics than I can read, right? Let alone all of these other fields. You need clinical decision support tools to synthesize that complexity and make it easy for you to know what test to order, who to order it for, and how to act on that in the context of other things that impact clinical decision making.
Well said. We'll get you out of here in just a moment. But first, if folks want to connect with either one of you to learn more about your work, the work of your wonderful organizations, what are the best ways for them to reach you, whether it's email, social media, all of those things? What are your favorite? Kristine?
Very easy to find me on LinkedIn, Kristine with a K, Ashcraft. Also, if you want to learn more about YouScript, you can go to youscript.com, and there is a contact us page if you have any questions. Always happy to hear from people that have questions about legislative efforts as well as pharmacogenomics or clinical decision support.
Hilary?
Sure. So you can also find me on LinkedIn, Hilary Gee Goeckner, but easiest way to get in touch with ACS CAN is fightcancer.org. You can click on your state. You can also follow, it's at ACS CAN on all of the platforms. So happy to get connected with folks and get you involved in what's happening in your state.
Well, ladies, I really appreciate your time today. It's great to dive into a little bit of the policy part of precision medicine. We don't do that very often, but it's something that's really important and often happening in the background and important to get citizens out there and aware of it and doing the things that they can in their state. So Hilary Gee Goeckner, Director of State and Local Campaigns for the American Cancer Society's Cancer Action Network, and Kristine Ashcraft, Founder and President of YouScript and Fellow Champion of ACS CAN. Thank you both for being with me today on the Precision Medicine Podcast.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thanks so much for having us.
You've been listening to the Precision Medicine Podcast, sponsored by Trapelo. Trapelo is the first clinical decision support tool to align the interests of oncologists, labs, and payers to give patients the best chance at beating cancer. To learn more, visit gettrapelo.com. We invite you to join the conversation on social media. You can find us on LinkedIn at the Trapelo Company page, also on X, formerly Twitter, at PMP by Trapelo, and you can also find us on YouTube at the Precision Medicine Podcast channel. If you know someone who would enjoy the Precision Medicine Podcast, please share it. They'll thank you, and so will we. We hope you'll tune in for the next episode.